So I wanted to welcome everyone. This will be our third virtual artist lecture, and we're so excited. We're thrilled. Um, I'm not going to introduce you, Jim. Nicole is, but I just wanted to say it would be awesome if you all could join us for the fourth and final lecture, which will be happening next week on Saturday, November 21st, and that'll be LaToya Morgan. And so I encourage you all to put that in your calendar and keep up with us on Instagram and all the other things. And I'm going to pass the baton to Nicole, who will go ahead and introduce our amazing lecturer tonight.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to move my Zoom over here and then read my words that are over here. Okay, so on behalf of the entire Visual and Media Arts Department, let me say welcome and thank you for virtually coming to LACC to share your work with us. I know you, so I'm gonna call you, it's weird for me to call you James, so I'm gonna call you Jim. I hope that's okay. You're over here, so I keep switching my angle. So Jim got his MFA from CalArts during the very exciting period of the 1970s in LA. He became the area head in photography at UCLA from 1995 through 2016. He now teaches at Princeton in New Jersey, but commutes from his home in New York and posts a lot of great commuter train videos, among other things, on his Instagram page, or at least, I guess you still do, but that's, you're right, back when we all used to do things in person. I have to admit, I got a little misty-eyed writing this introduction because I realized that, well, I did not work with Jim directly as a graduate student. I was a graduate student in LA in the 2000s, and it seems like everyone I know in LA, in my generation, the generation before my generation, the generation after my generation, who's at all interested in photography, and I would say who's making really interesting work involving photography, has some connection to Jim Welling. Jim is always open to experimentation in bending and exploring the materiality of photography. And there's a generation, as I said, of artists that came out of that UCLA MFA program who felt a similar freedom to use photography as they saw fit. Jim is one of those great artists who is a great artist and also an incredible teacher. His most recent show, Archaeology, was just up at Regan Projects on Highland. It's a perfect example of his process and his investment in experimentation. The photographic capturing of the subject is only the first step for Jim, or this is how I interpret it. The image often goes on a long journey after that initial point and comes out the other side as a whole different entity. Jim is admired by myself and many others for his openness and eagerness to embrace the unreliability of photography, all the ways it can go wrong or give you something completely different than what you expected. And I imagine students here can relate to that, specifically to, yeah, photography and darkroom photography work. And how taking the time to really investigate and work through individual characteristics of the medium often bear the most exciting and unexpected fruit. And of course, it's through this experimentation that deeper connections are forged between Jim's photographic subject and their pictorial meaning. His work is held by every major institution in the country, as far as I can tell, and many more abroad. So please join me in welcoming James Welling to LACC.
Thank you, Nicole, for that embarrassing introduction. I'm feeling, I wish I could be in LA. You know, when Liz was talking about the next lecture, I was thinking, wow, I'd like to go to that. And what are we going to do after my talk? I guess I'm going to have dinner, a very late dinner. So without further delay, I'm going to try to screen share and get my preview. I'm going to show my talk in preview. It's a PDF. And I have, if you see there are two James Wellings. One's my cell phone, so I can kind of see what you're seeing. There we go. Okay. So as Nicole, can everyone hear me? Okay. I do have an external microphone. I think I'm going to plug that in if I can. I'll just go without it. I've got too many things plugged into my computer. As Nicole mentioned, I went to CalArts at a very interesting time. I arrived in California. It's incredible to think 49 years ago, when CalArts had just moved up to Valencia. So I was like marooned up in Valencia for a couple of years when I was a student there. I didn't have a car. My main teacher was John Baldessari, although I worked with a very interesting video and performance artist named Wolfgang Sturkel. John took the class out for a little field trip. We just walked into the chaparral around the campus, and we made photo pieces with a camera that we all passed around. And I took this photograph of the class, well, kind of what was left of it. A few people just wandered off, had to go to other classes. But John's standing there against the tree, and Didi Basic is on the left, Suzanne Kuffler, who ran was a grad student, but ran gallery A402, amazing gallery, Matt Mulliken, next to Suzanne, and Dave Trout, who was a member of the band The Weirdos after CalArts. So it was a very interesting group of people at CalArts at that time. I did not study photography. I made video work and basically read a lot. I had studied previously painting and sculpture in Pittsburgh at Carnegie Mellon. And I also studied modern dance, which will become, you'll see, important later in my talk. So when I graduated from CalArts, I really was not committed to photography. I sort of had made a few prints in the darkroom, but it took a year of kind of figuring out what to do, struggling, being very unhappy with sort of conceptual work. I wandered into a friend's darkroom. He had his own darkroom in Venice, and I made some photograms of my hands. Now, if you know anything about photograms, these are positive images. So I took those original photograms, and about a month later, contact printed them onto another sheet of paper. So I made a positive photogram. And without really understanding, what I was doing, I was already messing around with sort of the elements and procedures of photography. As I said, I never studied photography, but I became very interested in it when I was 24, a couple of years after CalArts. And I bought a Polaroid camera, and actually I didn't buy it. I broke a Polaroid camera and had to buy my friend a new one. I had borrowed his camera, so I was stuck with a broken Polaroid camera. The shutter was broken. It was always open. So after a few weeks, I realized that I could put a milk cap on the front of this camera and put film in it, put the camera on a tripod and make exposures of 1 second or longer. So that limited me in what I could photograph. So I wandered around the space I was living in Venice and made pictures of my living space and hang on a second. What's going on here? There we go. There we go. And the restaurant that I worked in. So if anyone's worked with Polaroid, you know that there's a box of 10 sheets of film, and it's really hard not to shoot all 10 in one go. So I found it a very frustrating medium to work with. But I would do things like This is a photograph of a shampoo bottle in the shower, and I peeled it apart before it was fully processed. And this picture of my bike, I didn't have a car, so I rode around by bike. I heated it over my gas stove because Polaroid recommends that you warm the picture, this early Polaroid film, when it was being processed. So already I was, without understanding it, I was both experimenting with the material properties of the medium, but also realizing that color development needs hot temperatures. At some point, in 1976, when I was 25, I bought a 4x5 camera, really cheap wooden 4x5 for $60. And I bought a really cheap lens, and I went out and started taking photographs around West LA. Because I felt so exposed, it was very easy to photograph at night when I had my dark cloth and my camera on a tripod. And so I took a lot of pictures at night, although I was stopped by the police and dragged down to the Santa Monica police station because I hadn't paid a bike ticket. I got a ticket on my bike, and so I had to spend a few hours in jail before I was bailed out. But otherwise, I photographed around Santa Monica and West LA, and then I photographed my friends. This is someone who worked in the restaurant I worked in. This is an alley in Santa Monica. Right before I left LA in 2016, I went and visited this particular alley. And unfortunately, a sign has been affixed to that fence in the foreground that says no parking. But otherwise, it's completely unchanged. So this is the darkroom that I used. I lived in an office building for 2 years in Santa Monica at 508 Santa Monica Boulevard. And it was barely dark. I could barely get it dark, and I used a special paper that didn't need total darkness, and I processed my film in what's known as a changing bag. Very primitive, but you'll note the photo timer in the left-hand side of the frame. That'll appear later in my present darkroom. This is a good friend of mine, Jack Goldstein, who was a few years older than me. And he was sort of like my older brother. We both lived in this office building, and Jack would talk to me about his ideas. He made films and eventually paintings. This is the filmmaker Erica Beckman, who went to CalArts a little bit after me. When I moved back to LA in 1995, I met someone who said, "Hey, Jim, I really like those pictures you made in the 70s. Why don't you go back and photograph LA?" This was in 2003. And so I revisited Los Angeles, this time with an 8x10 view camera, and took some pictures in this sort of the same neck of the woods that I photographed in the 70s. It's an alley, Santa Monica Pier. And this is in East LA. So switching back to those pictures I took in LA in the 70s, I moved to New York in 1979 and was really unclear about what to photograph. I felt very uncomfortable with a 4x5 on the street in New York. So I sort of turned inward and worked for a couple of years in this little loft space that I had. It had basically no windows, and made still lifes in the studio. And this particular project, it's called aluminum foil. I photographed a piece of aluminum foil. I was working in a restaurant and always wrapping things in aluminum foil. And I thought this would be an interesting subject to photograph if it was lit properly and also printed in such a way that it doesn't really look exactly like aluminum foil. It has lots of other associations, at least for me. landscapes, water, all kinds of different things. This is in the early 80s, and I became associated with a group of artists who I was friends with, but in some ways my work really wasn't that connected to the so-called pictures generation, people like Cindy Sherman and Barbara Kruger and Sherry Levine, all of whom I knew and would hang out with. But unlike their work, they were interested in sort of making points about photography or society. I was still struggling with the medium. How do you make a photograph? What could it mean? Can you make an abstract photograph? So these were very experimental pictures for me. And even though I've been associated with this group of artists, it was less, it was more like a friendship rather than really common goals. These were also very small, they're 4 by 5 inches. And here's an installation photograph of when I showed them in 1981. I showed, I think, 38 in 2 rows of, or 36 in 2 rows of 18. I'm going to go through 3 or 4 different abstract series. This was another sort of restaurant-inspired series. I was making a dish using pastry dough, also known as fila dough. And somehow or other, I thought it would be an interesting thing to photograph. So I let it dry out and sprinkled it on drapery. And these pictures are, to me, very mysterious, like what exactly is going on. They're sort of like weird still lifes. And then a few years later, I sort of revisited this theme, these drapes, flags, as large Polaroids. I rented the Polaroid studio and arranged this piece of kind of really cheap silk, brown silk, in different configurations. So we're now about 1990. Oops, actually I'm jumping back. This is an earlier, slightly earlier project right after those drapery, black and white drapes. I read, and interesting, this is half of the equation of photography. I read that all analog photographs use gelatin. And I thought, I'm gonna photograph gelatin. So I bought some I bought some Jello, black cherry Jello, and started photographing it on a piece of white paper. And nothing really looked very good until I put India ink into it. So it became very, very black with these sort of scintillations of light. And these are pretty small subjects, but then I printed them 30 by 40 inches. And I used a special film, a high contrast film that was very fine grained. So there's really no grain and very crisp black and white relations. So gelatin you'll see will become important later in recent work. And then after I started teaching at UCLA in 1998, I made this group of photographs. And the photo program at UCLA was started by someone named Robert Heineken, who was a former Marine pilot, a sort of, as I understand it, slightly sort of fast-talking, chain-smoking, very interesting photographer who worked in experimental photography. And when I got to UCLA, Robert had retired. I had lunch with him one day, but the dark rooms and the whole vibe of the UCLA photography program at that point was still had a Heineken aura, in that every student got their own individual darkroom. So you could do experiments in these little black and white closets. And it just seemed like this sort of experimental vibe there. So I caught the virus, the experimental virus. If I didn't already have it, I was reinfected, and I became interested in, probably not the best metaphor today, but I began to make photograms again. And as I did in the 70s, I flipped them around. And what are these pictures of? These are little scraps of paper that I would, if you ever are around a photographer, you know that they are always trimming prints. And there are these little slivers of paper and 1-inch pieces of paper. So I threw them onto a piece of photographic paper and made photograms. And then at this point, I was working digitally. So I scanned those photograms and made them into positives, and then flipped them around and made a digital negative. So it was a rather like a 3-step process, and then made large prints of these. Architectural, construction, constructivist, spatial. I learned that there had to be a certain number of elements in the picture to make it work. I made a lot of ones that were failures. And this is something that I've discovered about photography, is when you're working on a series or a body of work, there are these rules that you discover as you go along. Anyway, this is true of any photo project that you're working on. Certain pictures fit, certain pictures don't fit. And that helps you sort of figure out what it is that the work is demanding. And these photographs demanded a certain number of fat bars, a certain number of medium ones, and a certain number of skinny ones, with most of them not ending in the picture, but extending beyond the frame. But a few you could see the ends of a few. Following that up, I worked with bunches of a common plant. It grows by the freeway. It's called Plumbago. It has a blue flower. And I made photograms on some film that a friend of mine had given me. He gave me a whole box of 8x10 film that was outdated. And so I made a whole slew of photograms of these Plumbago blossoms on 8x10-inch film, and then printed them in the color with a color enlarger with different colored filters in front of the lens. So these are all monochrome images that I'm then sort of painting with colored light, as it were. I think this one I did digitally. I did not have access to the color darkroom, or I wasn't able to use the enlarger. So this is a digital sort of version of the same process, as is this one. This is analog. So when I was making those pictures of flowers, I, of course, remembered Andy Warhol's flower paintings. And I was invited to do a talk in New York at the Dia Art Foundation on one of the artists in their collection. And I talked about Andy Warhol, how Andy Warhol was actually a secret photographer, even though he made paintings. He worked in silkscreen, which is a kind of laborious process where you push colors through, a stretched screen using different photomechanical processes. Around the same time, I also became interested in psychedelic imagery. And in fact, I teach a class at Princeton. It's just ending. It's called Pathological Color. And I'm encouraging the students to do all the things that you're taught not to do in digital photography, psychedelia. And so this is a 1968 Richard Avedon photograph where he managed to make this picture of John Lennon using what's known as posterization techniques. So inspired by Warhol and John Lennon, and also someone like Robert Rauschenberg, who, like Warhol, worked in silkscreen, but also had some painted elements. Finally, the inspiration for this large body of work that I'm going to show you that I made in California starting in 2013-14 was this weird thing, this yellow sheet of paper. And this is called a make ready. It's when you print a book or anything using a printing press, the first 50 or so impressions on an industrial press are not acceptable. You have to run sheets of paper through to get the press up to speed. My father, who worked in the printing business, called it usable scrap or make ready. So these make readies, the printers would save them and then run them through for the next job. So you'd get all of these strange combinations of images on top of each other. And it turned out that there were photographers in the 1970s who are pretty much forgotten, who worked in a similar fashion, superimposing different photographic images in color on top of each other. And this is a photograph by a long forgotten but very interesting photographer, Scott Hyde. And this is a photographer who, named Syl Labrot, who worked in photo offset. So his artwork were printed pages with these overlays of images, printed sequentially. So I mentioned that I studied modern dance when I was an undergraduate. And in 2012, 2013, I decided I wanted to make a photo project about dance. I wanted to do something with color. I wanted to do something with these multiple images on top of each other. So I got together a group of UCLA art students who turned out they were studying modern dance with someone I knew from Cal Arts, Simone Forti. And they would be my subjects, and I would pose them based on historic dance photographs. So this is a suite of photographs from around 1920 of a French-Russian ballet company called Ballet Russe. And this is the photograph that resulted from the students who were mimicking the dance pose in that picture. And I put 3 photographs on top of each other. It turned out that the best way to do this is to put different black and white pictures in the red, green, and blue channels of a color document. So you get this wonderful transparency, almost like a double exposure. These very early pictures, I can see at least 2 of the channels. There's obviously architecture in the background, and there's a third dance picture with this dominant blue channel photograph. So I spent 4 Saturdays photographing this group of students, and then worked on processing the images. A few months later, I came to New York and photographed Barnard College dance students and Columbia University dance students. And I worked with someone named Timberly Canal, who was a dancer who helped coordinate the shoot. And lastly, you can see someone else is taking the picture. When I worked on these dance shoots, especially the ones that I was coordinating, I tried to have a second photographer because there was always something going on that I was missing when I was photographing. And in fact, this is that same group of New York dance students. And if you look carefully, it may be hard to see. I'm on the left of the picture photographing. My assistant, J.R. Valenzuela, is photographing at the same moment that I'm photographing. So part of this photograph is my picture that I took, and part of it is JR's with me on the side. And here's one of the reference images, Yvonne Rayner. And then this is the picture that resulted as the reenactor improvised. And this is a photograph of a Martha Graham dance. And then this is the improv reenactment. I discovered that brutalist architecture, massive blank concrete shapes were really good for this project. I tried a lot of different things, elements in the background behind the dancers, and it turned out that architecture, modern architecture, seemed to work best. I also used landscape images, a snowy field. These two pictures that are coming up are whatever you could call them progressive variations as I'm working through this photograph of a French Canadian dancer at Royce Hall. And I'm trying to figure out how to get these two pictures to work. And I finally decided that I would just use one half of the left side. But these yellow shapes are some of the painting that I did with the brush tool to paint away some of the channels. So as I evolved this process, I began to sort of understand what I need. Some landscape, architecture, and dance. And when one of these, the two elements that are not the dance, dominate, then I would paint on the channel. I'd paint it gray, or I'd paint it white or black to eliminate it. And here's a performance by, dance by Kyle Abraham. And you can see I'm sort of painting away in the background through one of the channels. And this is the final picture where I decided I would paint circles to cut through the front image of those dancers in blue to other dancers in the background. I've been asked, do you want everyone to see all of the different layers? And it's not important that you see or really understand exactly what the layers are, but I want some of them to come forward. These sort of bubbles on the right hand of this picture were made with a cell phone in San Francisco. So I'm using my Canon 5D. I'm also using a cell phone and just putting the information into the these three channels. There's a lot of painting away on different layers. So this picture has about 20 different adjustment layers: hue and saturation, selective color, gradient maps, and then I'll paint back most of them and just leave little fragments of these colors. Like that Kyle Abraham picture, this picture, which was photographed at the Museum of Modern Art, a dance concert by a Belgian choreographer, Anna Teresa de Kiersmaker. There's no other elements beside the three pictures I took in the museum of the performance. But this picture, you can hardly see the dance, and you can see instead there's a sort of beach shack, a surfer beach shack in north of San Francisco. This is one of the last pictures. So actually a lecture and a dance performance up at Columbia University. And there's a video projection. So what appears to be one of the channels is actually a video projection behind the dancer. Early on in the process, I worked with a very interesting company called the Los Angeles Dance Project, LA Dance Project. And this next group of pictures, I think until the end, are all LA Dance Project rehearsals, a rehearsal on a stage. This is a performance I photographed in New York. And it was really a fantastic experience to work with the same dancers over a 2-year, 2.5, 3-year period. At a certain point, I made friends with a collaborative duo named Gerard and Kelly, Brennan Gerard and Ryan Kelly, who for a time were graduate students at UCLA. And then they began choreographing. This is a dance that took place in a number of different locations over the course of a couple of years. It's called Modern Living. And this was a staging of the dance at the Schindler House. And this dancer, Rochelle, is here in red. And then Anthony, here at the Philip Johnson Glass House, is dancing the same part 2 years later. And the dance takes place over vast distances. At the Schindler House, there's a dancer over Rochelle's left shoulder, and a dancer's down in the left center at the Glass House. This entire performance at the Glass House was photographed by an assistant, Evan Whale. I sort of told him what I wanted, and I showed him previous works, but he just had free rein to take a lot of pictures, and I worked with about 5 or 6 of them. The final iteration that I've worked on of this dance called Modern Living was in France. And I hired a photographer to photograph the performance. So this took place outside of Paris. And then I went to the location and photographed elements of the building that it took place in. The last work that I photographed was also at Royce Hall, or I worked with. My assistant photographed this in February this year. It's called The Four Quartets. And Pam Tamowitz is the choreographer. And like some of the other pictures, there were just dance photographs here. There's no other elements introduced. And this is another Kelly and Gerard performance. So as I was working on choreograph, putting stuff together in the 3 channels, I did another project for a museum in Connecticut named the Wadsworth Atheneum. And they wanted me to photograph, make some pictures to celebrate their new opening of the museum. And so I went to the museum, which I knew very well because I grew up outside of Hartford, and it was my hometown museum. And I took pictures of, this is a Tony Smith sculpture in the lawn. This is the big hall. And then this fountain, which is a Renaissance sculpture. And as I looked at this and worked on this picture, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if I investigated or thought about photographing sculpture? First of all, it doesn't move. I'm not going to have any problems with the dancers. And secondly, I don't have to get model releases, because I found that it was time consuming to get everyone to sign releases. to in order to make work with the dances. And I was just interested in sculpture. So I went to the Metropolitan Museum in New York in 2018, 2 years ago, over 2 years ago, and began to photograph Roman and Greek sculptures. And I photographed this particular bust. It's of a Roman woman. I read later, because I didn't think much of this photograph, but I did photograph her head on. So I had a photograph of this woman, Julia Mamea, and a digital file, and I printed it out using an inkjet printer on a piece of transparent material. I made a digital negative. And for the last couple of years, I've been reading about old photo processes. And I became very interested in this one process called Collatype, where you mix a sensitizer with gelatin. I said gelatin would come back. So I made my own emulsion out of gelatin and potassium dichromate and painted it onto a piece of plastic watercolor paper called Yupo. I let it dry, and then I exposed it to ultraviolet light through the negative, and that makes a matrix. It's a relief map in gelatin. And I then coated that with dye. And then I made this picture, same process, same negative, completely different. This was the third one. I realized that this negative was printing at a mind of its own, and it just kept changing. So here are the elements: gelatin, digital negative, ultraviolet light. Wash it, washes away all the unhardened parts. I used fabric dyes and aniline dyes, and that's the process. So I made over 200 prints of this head, which just kept changing genders, age, century. And then I became interested in, I flipped the negative. And then at a certain point, I had read that you could put oil paint onto certain photo processes and get what's known as a bromoil print. So I began to use oil paint. This is oil on that same gelatin matrix. And then after working with potassium dichromate for 3 months steadily, I realized that it's a carcinogen and I wanted to stop. And I did some research, and it turns out that there are a number of printmakers who were interested in non-toxic printmaking. So I concocted this new process, which is what I showed at Regan Projects, using a pronto plate, which is a piece of plastic that is designed to be printed with a laser printer, Hewlett-Packard 5000 series laser printer, and then coated with oil paint. You wet the plate after it's been laser printed, and when it's wet, you can roll oil paint onto it. So this is one of the pictures that was at Regan Projects, and you can see it's a wreath. This is a wreath from Greece. I continued on the antiquity theme. I photographed in museums in Athens, in Venice, in Germany, photographing Greek and Roman objects, and began this body of work that I'm still working on. But this will show you. So this is the file that I printed on the laser printer and then rolled it with blue, black ink to get this image. This picture of a bronze crab, probably used on furniture, that's what the starting point was. And then I rolled a transparent blackish bluish ink on it. So I'll quickly go through these because I have one more thing to show you. What was amazing about this process is that I'm using oil paint, mostly a blackish blue, and I print the laser print very saturated with saturated colors, and then the blue and the black dull the saturated colors down, but you can still see them sort of vibrating. One of the things that I discovered, I went to Athens and photographed this very famous sculpture, Poseidon. This is my picture of it. In photographing these objects, these sculptures, I realized that when you crop in, the sculpture becomes something different. When you see the whole figure standing there, he's in motion. But when you crop into the picture, and I did this with a number of Greek and Roman sculptures, something else emerges. So when I look at this picture, I just see a dude standing with his arms outstretched, telling the sculptor, when are you going to be finished? This is getting tiring. Something else I did was occasionally I'll mimic well-known to me photographs. This is a 19th century picture, and I went to London and photographed the same sculpture from the same angle. But the big thing is trying to instill a kind of sense of vitality or vivaciousness or aliveness in these sculptures. And also the kind of human connection when arms are touching arms or beseeching hands. So I began to look for these moments of tactility and a forearm. Amazing sandal. You know, 300 BC. That's pretty good. Pretty good sandal. Or this very gentle touch. This is Socrates. A makeup container. A beautiful well. A gold leaf wreath. Vases. Fig leaves. I did some black and white also. Torso of an athlete. Head of a priest. A temple in Athens, the Hephaestion. On the Acropolis. More Acropolis. This is a floral ornament where I just rolled out orange oil paint onto this black and white picture to see what would happen. And this is the last image of the series. It's a kind of angelic figure from terracotta, probably Roman, 100 AD. So after this deep dive into antiquity for 2 years, when COVID hit, I continued to work on these pictures, but I also, like a lot of people, was wondering what to do with the shutdown and what's happening in the world. So I began to photograph out my window, my studio window, which looks out on a street in New York. And I'm not sure what I'm gonna do with these 10,000 or so photographs, but I made a short 4-minute video of the first 2 months that Liz will stop sharing, and Liz will play for us.
And you'll just let me know that the sound is working.
So the sound starts a few seconds into it. So that's, I think the playback was a little, not Liz's fault, but I think it's Zoom's fault. I think each slide stays on the screen for about a little bit less than a second. So that's even pacing. I'm not quite sure why some stayed longer, but anyway. And the music is by an Argentinian duo whose name has escaped me, but they were students at Princeton, architecture students. Alfredo Thurman and his collaborator. So
open it up to Q&A. So if anyone wants to ask a question, please type it in the chat, and either I'll read it out, or if you want to ask it, you could just let me know that you want to ask it. You could ask your question directly. Thank you, Jim. That was really nice.
Oh,
You went through how many years of photo history from the 70s to today?
a little too many, but
Knowing your work, I know there's a lot that actually was edited out.
one of the things that what I'm doing now with the this weird oil paint process is trying to do something digitally but have a analog feeling, and I've been futzing around with it for a number of years, and this is the first time, especially with the Julia Mameas and the oil pictures, where I really feel like I can combine analog and digital by hand, which was sort of one of my goals, but it still is a photograph.
Yeah.
Replacing the darkroom.
It also sounds like you had to figure out how to make it less toxic, which I think whenever you're dealing with something that's part analog, it seems to always be a consideration, the toxicity of materials. We have a lot of questions. So Lovepreet asks, did you ever become frustrated while trying to figure out what your work was demanding? If so, what did you do in those periods?
Well, I don't know if you've had this experience, but you make one photograph that you think is really fantastic, like a new picture, and it points in a direction, and then you think, oh, this is great, I'm just going to keep going in this direction, and then you can never get back to the sort of grace of that first original picture, and you have to try really hard to figure out what it is that made that picture so exciting to you and led you to head in this direction. So the frustrating thing is, of course, it's frustrating to try to figure out what to do, but once you do something or you feel inspired, is to be truthful to that initial impulse, or the luck that you encountered to make that picture. So the frustration usually is trying to get back to that innocent moment when everything kind of converged and you had this great photographic experience. So how do you keep that sense of whatever it is in the body of work? That's the frustrating thing.
Yeah, there's that one magic moment and then trying to get there. Our next question comes from Trey. Do you have any impactful books you were reading back when you were at CalArts that you'd recommend to students to broaden their conceptual approach to art making?
Well, I recently bought a book by Levi Strauss. Let me get it. You like the cover. It's by Claude Levi-Strauss, who was, is a very important, old-time anthropologist who a friend of mine was reading it and he said, you should read it. And I read Levi-Strauss, when I was a student in the 70s. So that was something that I was reading, that people were reading, anthropology and looking at systems of representation. So, but I read a lot of different things. I spent the last year reading on antiquity because I didn't know much about it. So that's what I've been reading. I'm sort of slowing down on that, but yeah. Next question.
Next question is from Sherilyn. For someone starting out, what is a camera you would recommend? I've been told my iPhone is more than sufficient, but it doesn't provide any inspiration.
Well, I do think you need something. I think an iPhone can make really interesting work, and you can make really interesting photographs with an iPhone for sure. I'll just share that we at Princeton, incredibly enough, bought a color processor so we can make color darkroom photographs. I think all the schools have gotten rid of their color processors. But we have a really exciting faculty member who's actually living in LA now. And during COVID, she'll be teaching at Princeton, Dina Lawson. So Dina was hired recently and she insisted that we get a color processor. So we struggled with trying to get students to use film again. And what I discovered was point and shoot, 35 millimeter point and shoots, which cost anywhere from $25 to $75 when you buy them online or at a used camera store, is actually a really great camera to have. That said, if you can get the film processed, or you can shoot black and white. So I would suggest thinking about a point and shoot camera. A. B, you want a digital camera. You know, in a way, it's unimportant what kind of camera you get. I personally bought a used Nikon D3400. This is my favorite camera. I think it cost a couple of $100, and I make the best photographs with it. So it doesn't, you know, cameras are, in a way, they're unimportant. Except those are my two recommendations, a point and shoot or a D3400.
I like the price range. Our next question is from Lewis. Do you usually know the outcome of what an image is to become beforehand? Are you informed by the subject matter as to where you will go with the image?
Well, it's really a kind of process of discovery. When I went to the Metropolitan Museum because I wanted to photograph figurative sculptures, I had no idea where I'd end up. So I went to every different department and ended up in Greek and Roman. But I didn't really know much about Greek and Roman work, so I studied it. So I think part of the work of the photographer is to know the subject. The better you know your subject, the closer you're going to get to it, whatever that subject is. Now, what was it? What was the question again? How do I?
It's like, do you know where the photograph is going, or are you informed by the subject?
Well, first of all, I think, you know, we as photographers discover the world through our photographs. So we take a picture of something that we don't really understand or don't completely have a grasp of, and then we decipher it through looking at our own photographs and then going back and taking more pictures. So there's this constant process of understanding how we see the world through the camera, which is, I think, one of the most exciting things about being a photographer, is that you learn about what you're photographing as you're photographing it. And like it's, of course, it helps to know a lot about the subject, but it actually is better not to know and to learn through your pictures.
Thanks. Our next question is, do you ever have moments of creative blocks? And if so, how do you stay inspired?
Well, I'm kind of reaching the end of the road with my pictures of antiquity, and I am a little bit worried about where I'm going to go. I mean, I like taking pictures out of my window, but that's not going to, that's reaching an end too. So I'm not exactly sure where I'm going to go next. And that is a little, I do have a little anxiety about that. But in general, I have lots of ideas that are backlogs of things that I haven't worked on. So this is why it's important as a young artist to write down your ideas and keep them in some place where you can, mentally, where you can review them, because what you find interesting about the world, about life, about photography, the current situation, the books you're reading, that is your reservoir. And that's where, when you finish one project, you're going to go, oh, I've always wanted to do something else, this other thing. Generally, those other things present themselves to you. You remember that that's something you were interested in. So that taking your ideas seriously and the things that interest you is very important.
Thanks. The next question comes from one of our faculty members, Laurel Paley. And the question is, as a professor, what are some of your favorite assignments?
I don't really, let's see, do I give assignments? I don't know. The whole COVID thing is I've been giving very specific things to do with Photoshop, things that I've discovered, usually what I call off-road techniques. That's one thing I've been doing. I'm drawing a blank. So I'm going to teach a class on a kind of hybrid class of performance photography and political photography and conceptual photography. So I'm going to have some prompts. I think one of the first assignment is going to be make black and white photographs.
Nice. And then a second part, same person. Do you ever collaborate? Do you ever create installations?
No.
All right. Our next, easy one. Our next question comes from Jennifer Alessi, and it's maybe more of a comment. We were blessed with the gift of one of Jim's photos after my husband, Larry, worked on one of his wife's movies, The Moment.
Oh.
They graciously welcomed us into their LA home, and we so enjoyed our conversation there. It has been a highlight of our decade here, and the work hangs proudly in our home office, an inspiration. We'll never forget yours, and Jane's generosity.
Well, one of the problems with, being in the contemporary art world is my work does sell for, prices are high, but I do have a photograph for sale for $50 at the George Eastman Museum in Rochester. It's a benefit photograph for the museum. And can't beat the price. I printed it myself. And I also took part in a couple of, benefits recently, one for Biden and another for COVID. But those sales have all, they had specific time limits. But check out the George Eastman Museum bookstore. They have one of my photographs for sale. Plus, I haven't really got it going, but on my website, I want to have a free download section where you can download one of my photographs and print it yourself. I just have to write the text for it, because that's one of the great things about the government, is that you can download Walker Evans photographs and other people's pictures And I want to have that on my website. Actually, if you go on my website, you'll see that there are pictures to download. I just haven't put out the language to alert you to it.
Mm. Oh, how fun. That's such a fun thing to do. We have a couple more questions and then maybe we'll wrap it up. One comment from another professor. We have a 54-inch Creonite at LACC RA4 processor.
You do?
Yeah,
Oh.
and we have to convince the admin to set it up. But yeah, so we have it in pieces maybe. The next question is, do you have a favorite photo that you have personally taken and what makes it your favorite?
Well, it's usually the first picture of any body of work because it leads the way. That's always the way it is. It's like there's always a pioneer picture that gets you going. So those are always my favorites.
Yeah.
Or the last one. Or the last one. That last picture I showed of the angel is the last of this body of work called Cento. Even though I haven't finished it, that's the last picture. Because it's both, you know, kind of to me it expresses the time, this sort of dark moment that we have been in until recently.
Yeah, totally. And then our last question, I think folks are really into your opinions on cameras. What are your thoughts on Fujifilm Instax mini cameras? I try to capture moments in the dark and the pictures come out dark. Trying to learn how to work it and create memories.
Is this a instant film camera? Is that what you're talking about? Yes. Yeah. We at Princeton, when COVID hit, some people used Fuji instant cameras. I've recently never had much luck with them. In fact, I have a impossible project Polaroid camera. So you're shooting black and white or color with that camera? Color. Well, what I would suggest you do is you take that instant picture and use it as a starting point to scan it or rephotograph it with your cell phone or to process it somehow and to keep going with it. I'm working with a student at Princeton who's using an a Polaroid type, you know, instant film camera. And I really think that she needs to process the pictures. I mean, work with the pictures more. The great thing about the instant photography, the Polaroid Fuji process, is that it comes out right away. But then I think it needs to be transformed in some way. Not sure what that is, but I would suggest that you take another step somehow with it. Maybe it needs to be mounted on a piece of fabric or something, or maybe it needs to be somehow transferred. Because it's behind that plastic, something weird about that. It's just me. But you know, maybe you'll find something to do with it, to take it to another place. So that would be my advice. You know, just off the top of my head.
I think that's great advice. Why not? Thank you, Jim. It was so wonderful having you. And thank you so much for, you know, dealing with the time difference and joining us from New York. It's awesome.
I wish I could be there, but
yeah, then we could all go out to eat in this hypothetical world. Non-COVID life.
So good luck with everyone's projects. When does the semester end?
December. December, I think it's like December 11th. I'm not, yeah. Mid-December.
Okay, well, Nicole, send me some pictures of what everyone's doing.
Oh, I will. Yeah, I'd love to share. They're doing good things, but it's helpful. Yeah, I'm just in terms of the students, right? We're also locked down and restricted. I think it's helpful to think about like, yeah, what can I do with this? How can I push this further? So I think that's really helpful to hear right now when we're all struggling with how to make work.
Okay,
All right.
very exciting. Nice to see everyone. Good
Nice.
luck.
Yeah. Enjoy your late supper.
Okay, okay. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.